We're starting tonight, folks, not with a philosopher or a king, but with something much riskier and more intricate: dating in the Middle Ages. Because, believe it or not, finding love during a plague was somehow even more awkward than texting someone, "What you doing?" at 2 in the morning. From courtly love songs to marriage by livestock negotiation and beyond. It's always interesting to see who is joining us from all over the world. So before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. You can also let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Medieval romance was more about land rights than butterflies. Dim the lights and maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. So you're standing in a medieval village, or maybe a chilly stone castle, wondering how to find love. Maybe strike up a conversation, compliment someone's house and ask if they come here often. Nope, that's not how any of this works if you're in the Middle Ages. Dating in the modern sense doesn't really exist. You don't flirt, text, or go for long walks to see where it goes. Instead, your parents or your lord or your abbot are already deciding who you'll marry, when, and how many cows it will take to seal the deal. If you're a noble, you've probably been betrothed since before your voice dropped. You and your future spouse might meet for the first time on your wedding day. And yes, that's just as uncomfortable as it sounds. The whole thing is about land, titles and family alliances, not compatibility or how good they are at lute solos. If you're a peasant, things are slightly less formal, but only slightly. Your family still has a strong say, and love isn't really part of the discussion. Maybe your parents know a nice girl whose family owns a productive goat. Maybe they admire a boy who can thatch a roof without falling off. Boom, you're courting now. Lucky you. It's not that people in the Middle Ages don't feel romantic. They do. It's just not the priority. The goal is survival, inheritance, and social stability. Falling in love before being married is dangerous. It's considered scandalous to fall in love outside of marriage, unless you're a character in a tragic poem, in which case you can fantasize despite being crazy. In this world, love may be the aim of poets, but marriage is the job of parents, priests, and politicians. Therefore, if you think someone is cute, it could be the way they confidently beat mud off a rug, or the way they balance a basket of onions on their head. You might also write a little verse on a scrap of parchment or sneak a glance across the market and fall in love with someone who wasn't pre-approved by your family's livestock appraiser. For now, though, you wait and obey, and try not to. Your medieval heart skips a beat, but calm down because romance in this world doesn't blossom without a balance sheet. Before you even consider courtship, you should ask yourself, what do I bring to the table? You might want to sit down if your response is a charming personality. If you're a young man, you'll need tools, land, animals, or a roof that doesn't leak too much. Love letters are nice, but nothing says husband material like 2 healthy oxen and a roof that can withstand a mild storm. If your father has already promised your brother the best goat, you might want to think about becoming a priest if you're a young woman. Your family needs a dowry, which could be cash, clothes, or an oddly large quantity of geese. No matter how clever you are, if your family is unable to pay, you will probably spend a lot of time honing your embroidery skills alone. Now, imagine that you actually like someone who makes your heart stop. You look at them, and there's a spark. That is romantic and poetic. But it doesn't matter because unless your families are on equal financial footing, you might as well fall in love with a cloud. If you are honorable, things get worse. Your marriage is dependent on political favors and geographic boundaries. You are more than simply a person. You are a living treasure. Congratulations. Marriage is realistic, even for peasants. You don't marry for butterflies. Rather, you marry because your pig pen borders someone else's wheat field. You dream of romance, but you settle for irrigation rights. Nevertheless, you try, and perhaps you give a tiny present. Perhaps they smile, perhaps they don't. But the fact about medieval dating economics is that flirting and love are merely a bonus that you hope your spouse develops over time. For example, let's say you're not a peasant worrying about pigs or a noble dealing with treaties. Suppose you are a knight with a large steed, fancy armor, and dubious poetic abilities. What is your love life like? Welcome to the strange and emotionally draining world of courtly love. This isn't dating, it's performance art. Courtly love was a noble pastime, part flirting, part spiritual suffering, and completely impractical. The brave knight chooses a noble lady, usually one who is already married, and vows to adore her from a distance. Not physically, of course, because that would ruin everything. Instead, you're supposed to suffer elegantly. You might write a few tortured verses about her silver laugh, or how her hair burns like the sun, which in medieval terms means she has hair and didn't insult your family. You wear her colors at tournaments, you pine, you sigh, and occasionally joust someone because he looked at her for too long. The lady's role is to pretend that all of this is very flattering while maintaining a level of icy detachment that would terrify a glacier. She might reply with a letter, a token, or even a ribbon, but mostly she will just be enigmatic and unreachable, which is the whole point. The emotions are high, but the actual contact is minimal at best. You might get a nod from the other side of the room or a finger brushing against your gauntlet during a feast or anything more, and suddenly it's not courtly love but a scandal, or worse, adultery, and nobody wants that, at least not formally. The whole setup worked best when everyone involved agreed that it was primarily a medieval venting mechanism, if you will. Was it dramatic? Yes, it involved more poetry than practicality constantly. But for a knight stuck between battles and boredom, you have fallen in love. But the difficult part is expressing that love in a society where touching someone's hand without a chaperone is essentially a declaration of war. Welcome to the medieval solution. Courtly love gave you something to write about and someone to write for, but don't expect a happy ending, a kiss, or even eye contact. Tokens. Imagine it as slow, perplexing texting from the 12th century that is susceptible to dramatically erroneous interpretation. Let's say you're a knight and you're madly in love with Lady Marjorie, whatever her last name is. You can't talk to her alone, so you send her a glove or perhaps your embroidered sleeve. Nothing says, "I love you," like mailing someone a piece of your wardrobe. If you're the one receiving it, congratulations. Now you have a sweaty linen sleeve you didn't ask for, and you have the romantic burden of acting like you understand what it means. He's confessing love and asking for a favor. He suggests a jewel, but women give tokens like a ribbon, a hairpiece, or a small pendant. It was heartfelt, to be sure, but it was also incredibly calculated. Give the wrong person the wrong token, and all of a sudden, someone with a drinking problem and a lazy eye speaks for you. Tokens were supposed to be subtle, like a glove pinned to your chest, or a ribbon tied to the hilt of your sword. No one explained what it meant, so the more cryptic the better. It was more about plausible deniability than communication. Oh, this glove isn't from Lady Joan. It just appeared on my pillow, smelling of lavender. And it was entirely random. For commoners, tokens were more straightforward, like a wood carving or a handkerchief you stitched when you weren't milking something. It was still romantic, but with more calluses involved. Receiving one you didn't want required finding out how to return it respectfully, while giving one to the incorrect person may start rumors. Despite the awkwardness, these tokens carried a lot of emotional weight because they were symbols of love in a world that didn't allow much room for it. So, when you finally find the courage to talk to your crush, you might offer them a flower or quote some bad poetry. You definitely didn't steal from a traveling minstrel, but you're not alone. Welcome to the world of medieval dating surveillance, where love is never blind and is closely watched by your mother, your priest, a nosy cousin, and sometimes all three at once. Let's say you're a young woman of marrying age, and you're never just going for a walk. You're going for a walk with Margaret and her terrifyingly strict aunt, who's already judging your posture, even if you're just fetching water. If you're a man courting someone, you better hope her family approves. You arrive at her home with flowers, along with her parish priest and the local gossip network. Her father is sharpening something behind the door. The rationale for all of this supervision was to protect virtue, preserve family honor, and absolutely prevent any unsanctioned touching, especially before marriage. especially when one is alone. Chaperones were present to watch innocent interactions, while her mother pretended to stir a pot that hasn't boiled in 3 hours, and the village priest happened to be passing by on his way to morning prayers at sunset. Group activities, supervised, walks, and sitting on benches within 2 meters of one another, but only if someone's grandmother is knitting close by and acting uninterested. Naturally, there were many viewpoints on the church, which managed courtship in the same manner that a bouncer controls a nightclub. Priests authored in-depth treatises on the perils of flirting and delivered sermons about appropriate behavior. Indeed, anti-flirting guides were issued by medieval clergy. Can you picture someone typing things out by candlelight, while monks silently condemn you from all over the scriptorium? Even composing letters wasn't safe. According to heavenly censorship, certain monasteries only opened love letters to check for moral content. You will therefore need to get used to falling in love, or at least medieval love, which is characterized by a lot of pacing near windows and aching confusion. Quietly, and in front of your entire extended family, and possibly God. Perhaps they picked up the handkerchief you dropped and didn't quickly toss it into the fire after you exchanged glances during a feast. Even if the stress is intense, you are still unable to talk freely. The most dangerous piece of paper since the excommunication notice is the secret love letter, which is your chance to confess your heart in the most cryptic and poetic language possible, because you can't just say, "I like you." Chaperones, priests, mothers, and other emotional border patrol agents are lurking around like emotional border patrol agents. You have to state, "My soul is a stag, pierced by the arrow of your grace roaming the forests of yearning." Naturally, if you're literate, which, let's face it, isn't a given, you write your message on rough parchment or vellum. If you're truly committed, you dust it with flower petals or perfume. However, be cautious, because one noble once delivered a herring to the wrong girl after using a love letter to wrap it. They're married now, so it's okay. But now comes the delivery issue. You can't just hand it over. You need a courier or a devoted servant, a younger brother who doesn't fully comprehend the repercussions, or a bribed monk. In a world of rigid roles and constant supervision, a folded scrap of words could feel revolutionary. So you write it, risk it, press your trembling hand to the parchment and say everything you can't say aloud, but don't sign it too clearly because you want romance. Sometimes even a minstrel would do the job, singing your poem in the town square while pretending it was anonymous subtle, and the poetry risky, very risky. If your metaphor even hinted at anything physical, you might find yourself confessing to both lust and literary exaggeration. A rare moment when life isn't merely labor, prayer, and pretending. Not a church trial, a feast day, a harvest celebration, a maple dance, etc. You can flirt with the blacksmith's daughter today as long as no one notices, or as long as everyone pretends not to. Welcome to medieval festivals, when passion blossoms in front of 3 chickens and everyone you've ever met. If you're a peasant, you might try to impress your crush by winning the sack race, catching a greased pig, or juggling 3 stale rolls of bread. Nothing says I'm available like falling off a hay bale with dignity. Dancing was your best chance at actual physical contact. The rules were strict, but a well-timed spin or an almost accidental hand graze could say more than any poem. Festivals were one of the few socially acceptable times when men and women could mingle, laugh, and dare we say, make eye contact. For instance, if you're noble, your version of flirting at a festival might involve less hay and more poetry. You might write a verse on the spot comparing your lady's eyes to twin candles or other glowing objects, and offer a trinket, ideally not one that was obviously made by your servant. Instead of using the maple dance, which was essentially a huge excuse for coordinated flirtation wrapped in ribbons and plausible deniability, 5 minutes ago, it was helpful to offer your sweetheart a meat pie or a honey cake. If they accept it with a smile, you're doing well. If they give it to their dog, start over with someone else. However, keep in mind that everyone is watching you. If you make a mistake, your flirtatious smile turns into a youthful transgression that is discussed at church for the next 6 weeks. For a few hours, You can act as though you're in a world where love isn't a transaction, where laughter isn't suspicious, and where dancing in public doesn't end in penance. Let's say you're not a knight, a noble, or a bard with a lot of money and excessive feelings. You're a typical peasant who spends most of the day knee-deep in muck, wakes up with the cows, and goes to bed with the hens. You're not searching for a romantic soulmate. Rather, you're looking for someone who can milk a goat without causing any emotional drama. In your culture, dating is more about shared work than lengthy chats. Welcome to peasant courting, where passion is pragmatic, gestures are modest, and chemistry means we can weather winter together. The entire criteria is that if you see someone you like, they work hard, don't whine a lot, and have a good set of teeth. You're realistic and not choosy. You need someone who can gut a fish and perhaps doesn't snore too loudly, not pyrotechnics. So, how do you express interest? Give them things. Tiny, practical items. A bundle of firewood and an egg basket. A nice turnip, and if you're feeling daring, a carved spoon or a weaved ribbon. Nothing conveys my serious feelings for you like a spoon, which you whittled by candlelight while your pig sadly condemned you. Conversations take place when doing chores together. For example, you may stroll to the mill and talk while caring for sheep, or make small talk while shoveling something that smells suspect. No one is reciting poetry. Instead, you are discussing weather, crop yields, and whether or not old Thomas fell in the well again. Despite this, there is a certain romance to the simplicity of a shared life that is based on cooperation rather than idealism. You know each other's strengths and weaknesses, and you are aware of how quickly they run when a goat escapes. If you both accepted, proposals frequently came quickly, and the families did as well. Marriage may follow. You may have moved into a shared hut, or you may have built a new one from scratch with assistance from the village. You brought your best blanket, and they brought a goat together, and you started the odd miracle of domestic survival. Although it's not glamorous, you've succeeded in finding someone who can cook healthily, put up with your family, and doesn't obviously cringe when they see your feet. Now is the moment for genuine love to tie the knot, which in medieval parlance meant signing a contract rather than making a romantic promise under the stars. If you're a peasant, it's still a huge event. You gather a few witnesses, speak to the local priest, and try not to trip over the Latin in this legally binding transaction that is frequently conducted with all the fervor of a cattle auction. During the ceremony, there is a serious checklist, hidden under the lovely sounding blessings. Who gets the cow, dowry property rights, and what happens if someone passes away before planting season? Ah, romance. If you belong to the affluent class, be prepared for a full-fledged legal negotiation in your marriage. Even though they may not have met the person you are marrying, your family has done the maths and your estate needs her fields. Your parents, the priest, the scribe, and possibly a cousin who studied law are all involved. The bride and groom primarily just stand close by, looking decorative and nodding when someone speaks to them. Her dowry balances, unless you can demonstrate that someone wasn't baptized, was secretly related to you, or passed away and you forgot to tell it. Your debts and both of your coats of arms look fine next to one another. Love is voluntary, but the merger is not. And once you're married, divorce isn't really a thing. Even if there were annulments, they still needed a lot of paperwork, a little bit of luck, and a substantial bribe. Some couples who truly fell in love with one another worked together to raise their kids and get through the winter. The church was involved in every step of marriage, which is essentially the same thing in medieval terms. Marriage was a holy sacrament, one of the 7 major ones, and you didn't just get married for legal reasons. God needed a witness, possibly 2. So you stand, exchange vows, and smile as someone hands over a sack of onions and calls it a blessing. Let's say you've had enough contracts, enough negotiations, and being treated like a particularly valuable sack of flour. You're a noble, but for once you want to marry for love, not for your father's strategic aspirations, not for land, not for your family. Congratulations, my darling. You're going to start a scandal. When you fled to marry someone of your own choosing, it was not just personal disobedience, but also political sabotage. Noble elopements were the medieval equivalent of setting your family tree on fire and dancing in the ashes. One day, you disappear to a monastery where the abbot owes you a favor, where you marry under dubious legality with only a nervous monk and 2 chickens as witnesses to the chaos back home. Let's say you are Lady Elelanina, who promised to suborn von estate secure, but you have fallen deeply in love with a poor squire who smells faintly of horses and adventure. You meet him in secret and whisper sweet nothings in the stables. Your mother sobbed into her stitching hoop, while your father threatened to enclose the groom's family garden. Your family was furious. The church was very worried about the gossip, so if you're the groom in this romantic rebellion, don't get too comfortable. In the best case, you get to keep your bride and your kneecaps. In the worst case, you're excommunicated and disemboweled in that order. However, some couples got away with it if the union couldn't be broken without causing even more embarrassment. In rare cases, families simply sighed and moved on because hopefully no one died. 2 aristocrats who chose love above duty were essentially mythological. And while most aristocratic weddings were transactional, these brief rebellions were accompanied by songs, poems, and stories that were whispered at feasts. Whispered promises and passionate escapes beneath starry towers. They reminded the world that love, though inconvenient, refused to go extinct. So if you ever feel dramatic for swiping left or turning down a second date, just remember, at least your love life doesn't involve secret weddings, angry barons, and a horse tied to a ladder outside your window. Marriage, that beautiful union of 2 souls and their respective financial portfolios. Because in the Middle Ages, love was nice, but a doughy. Now, that was truly romantic. Let's say you're a bride. You're not just getting married, you're being launched like a small, doughy, equipped economic vessel. Your family prepares your doughy money, livestock, land, linens, a cow or 2, depending on how lovable they think you are, and maybe even a set of pewter dishes if they're feeling generous. These offerings go to your future husband, who accepts you and your portable wealth with open arms and a mental calculator. Now flip the scenario. In some cultures or regions, it's not the bride's family giving the goods, it's the bride price. The groom pays her family for the honor of marrying her, effectively saying, "Here's a horse, a cloak, and 3 pigs. Now give me your daughter." Medieval romance at its best is when someone pays someone they are marrying, and there is unquestionably a receipt involved. These exchanges weren't just about money, they were also about public declarations and status expectations. The bride didn't usually get to keep the dowry. It became part of the household economy managed by her husband, guarded by the law, and hopefully not gambled away on dice and ale within the first month of marriage. If the marriage ended through death or annulment, or your husband wandering off to join a monastery after midlife regret, your dowry could theoretically be returned, but retrieving it was often harder than pulling a sword from a stone. You'd need support from the law and ideally someone who could read. A large dowry might indicate that the bride came from a prestigious family, while a stingy one might suggest they were trying to get rid of her quickly, possibly due to suspicious personality traits or a habit of talking back. It compensated the bride's family for the loss of her labor. After all, who's going to milk the sheep now? So while love was occasionally in the mix, money was always at the altar, so you didn't go the marriage route. Maybe you were the second son, or your dowry was suspiciously small, or you just really liked chanting. Either way, you've joined a monastery or convent. Congratulations, you've now taken a vow of poverty, chastity, and an aggressive disinterest in romance. And yet, here you are, in a stone cloister surrounded by silence, candle smoke, and Brother Anselm's unexpectedly soulful eyes. Yes, even behind monastery walls, forbidden love found a way to be clear. Falling in love in a religious order was deeply discouraged, like you might get whipped, exiled, or lectured by someone with a Latin name discouraged you've sworn to give your heart entirely to God, which means giving it to literally no one else. But hearts are unruly, and sometimes prayers start sounding a lot like love poems. Maybe it starts with innocent tasks passing each other, bread in the refectory, whispering. During Vespers, laughing a little too hard when someone drops a hymnal before you know it. You're tucking extra cheese into Sister Beatrix's satchel and questioning everything some monks and nuns wrote passionate letters, disguised, of course, as theological musings. Your soul is a shining light in the darkness of my contemplation. Sounds holy, unless you read between the lines, and many did. There were inevitably scandals, secret meetings in the herb garden, midnight confessions that weren't, strictly sacramental, and the occasional gasp-worthy discovery of a nun with a suspiciously round belly. The punishment usually harsh exile, public penance, or being reassigned to some far-off abbey known mostly for sheep and silence. Still not all. Stories ended in disgrace. Some lovers escaped, a few even got married after being defrocked. Most, though, returned to their cloisters, red-faced and redevoted, swearing that the whole thing was just an overzealous theological debate. Because in the end, monastic life was about discipline, but humans are humans, even in robes, even in silence. And sometimes a quiet glance across the chapel was more thrilling than any tournament or courtly poem. You did it. You got married. There was a priest, a pig, roast, and someone spilled me on your mother's only nice cloak. But now it's been a few months or years, and something feels off. Maybe your spouse snores like a dying lute. Maybe they forgot to mention their chronic gambling problem. Or maybe you just realize that marrying for land and sheep doesn't automatically result in romantic bliss either way. Welcome to the world of medieval marital disappointment. Now, don't go reaching for the divorce papers because they don't exist, at least not in any form you'd recognize. Marriage was a sacred and unbreakable bond approved by the church, sealed by God, and enforced by public shame. You could try for an annulment, but you'd need a very good reason. We don't get along, doesn't cut it. You'd have to prove that one of you was underage, already married or too closely related, which happened disturbingly often, or, in the best-case scenario, that the marriage was never consummated, which meant someone had to confirm that fact in writing, possibly under oath. Good luck. It becomes more messy if you're a noble. The best course of action for unhappy couples is to simply endure each other by sleeping in different beds, sighing dramatically at dinner, or expressing their feelings through embroidery, or that one really angry psalm. Your marriage was not just personal, it was political, and attempting to flee could start a feud, ignite a scandal, or start a small war. Your love language is passive aggressiveness. Of course, affairs mostly take place softly, but occasionally they may be spectacular. There were secret lovers among the nobility. Neighbors were oddly helpful to peasants. People continued to prowl about barns and blame things on God's enigmatic will for women, despite the church's condemnation, of course. It was particularly difficult to leave a bad marriage, even if your husband was violent or had disappeared. Society expected you to remain faithful, quiet, and somewhat religious while surviving on breadcrumbs and criticism. But some people managed to make it work. Marriages weren't always happy, but they could become partnerships forged by hardship, habit, and the shared experience of carrying firewood in the rain. Let's say your spouse passes away, perhaps from the plague, a farm accident, or tripping over a goose in the dark. The medieval dating pool suddenly opens up again. For women in the Middle Ages, widowhood often offered a taste of independence in managing land, making decisions, and even speaking in public without being instantly shunned. If you were young and still had teeth, you could remarry very quickly. However, being a widow was strangely liberating in that it did not allow you to do anything you wanted. There were mourning times, but survival instincts also existed. A widow without a husband and land was essentially a walking treasure trove of suitors who showed up at a startling rate. Some were sincere, while others were just overly excited about your dairy cows. If you're a man and recently widowed, society practically pushes you back into marriage. Who else is going to cook, clean, and raise the 11 children you somehow accumulated? So you start looking. Maybe the baker's daughter, maybe that quiet widow, who always brings suspiciously good meat to market romance in second marriages, could be surprisingly sweet this time around. You're older, wiser. You're not being pushed into an alliance. You're choosing someone to survive with, maybe even someone you. Like wild concept, of course there were rules the church frowned on. Remarriage that happened too quickly, like your spouse isn't cold yet quickly. and widows often had to negotiate with family over dowies and inheritance. Nothing says romantic second. Chance like arguing with your brother-in-law over who keeps the butter churn. But still, second marriages were common, even expected. Life was short. Winters were long. No one wanted to spend them alone if they didn't have to. And yes, love was part of it, maybe not the swooning sonnet writing kind, but the quiet kind based on shared stories, mutual respect, and the understanding that both of you had already seen some things. So you light the fire, pour the soup, and try again. Not because it's perfect, but because it's human. You've made it this far, survived the contracts, the courtships, the chaperones, and possibly a dramatic barn elopement. But before you fall for someone new, ask yourself the most medieval question of all. Are you cosmically allowed to love this person? Because in the Middle Ages, love wasn't just a matter of the heart, it was a matter of stars' bones. And whether or not your grandmother saw a fox this morning, let's begin with astrology. Yes, you might want to ask the local monk astrologer if your signs are suitable before kissing someone. Then there were birthmarks, mysterious little symbols that might identify you as your soulmate's long-lost twin or their destined executioner. Superstitions were flexible like that, but the church had its own checklist that said you couldn't marry your cousin, your second cousin, or your fourth cousin twice removed unless you had special permission, which the wealthy frequently bought because of loopholes. If Venus in retrograde was your beloved's birth under an unlucky moon, it would be better to marry someone less cursed. A noble could not fall in love with a peasant without it being deemed either a miracle or a moral failing, because social position was also very important. There were also the omens. If a raven flew overhead while you were thinking about someone, it was a bad sign. If you dropped bread at dinner while staring at your crush, forget it. That's a cursed union. Someone might bury a charm under your doorstep to protect you from unsuitable suitors or to sabotage your chances. And finally, cross-class romance was uncommon, scandalous, and only acceptable if it later became a tragic folk song. Everyone had an opinion about the weather, the stars, the saints, and that one woman in the woods who was probably a witch but wasn't. But people still loved clumsily, bravely, and frequently against advice because, whether or not it was medieval, the heart is still incredibly disobedient. Love in this world wasn't just personal, it was mystical. You have undoubtedly heard of Julius Caesar and Alexander the Great, but have you ever heard of Tamirus, the woman who is said to have severed Cyrus the Great's head and drenched it in blood? Her court was the open sky, her army was the wind, and her power came not from titles, but from unquestionable authority. She was queen of the mace, a confederation of nomadic tribes that roamed the steppes of Central Asia. Think horse archers, tattooed warriors, ritual feasts, and battlefield justice. Timaeus didn't inherit her power from a pampered courtier system. She rose through grit leadership and possibly a healthy dose of don't mess with me energy. Her people were tough, accustomed to harsh winters, long migrations, and enemies on every side. But even among such people, she stood out. She was a warrior, a lawgiver, and a ruler in her own right. No husband overshadowed her. No brother guided her hand now. To be clear, much of what we know about Tamirus comes from the Greek historian Herodotus, a man not exactly known for his strict fact-checking. But if even a fraction of his account is true, then Timaeus wasn't just a queen. She was a storm in human form. At the heart of her story is this: a foreign superpower was growing stronger by the day. The Achaemenid Persian Empire led by Cyrus the Great. He had already conquered Lydia and Babylon, and now his gaze turned east. The Massage were next on his list, but Cyrus didn't fully understand what kind of woman he was dealing with before the first arrow flew, before the first spear shattered, and before her son's death changed everything. Because she refused to submit, Timaeus was already preparing for war, not because she wanted to conquer, but because she was defending a way of life. And as Cyrus would soon discover, there are some queens. You just don't invade. When Cyrus the Great looked east towards the land of the Mazache, he didn't exactly expect resistance, because he was known for being a conqueror's conqueror, the kind of man who could walk into ancient cities, topple empires, and still be remembered favorably by historians. Cyrus first made a polite offer because, of course, every good imperialist begins with a smile. He proposed a political marriage between himself and Ptolemus, which you might think is romantic, but Ptolemus saw right through it. She knew that this wasn't about love or even alliance, but rather control. And if she married Cyrus, her kingdom would become just another province of the Persian Empire. Cyrus, who wasn't used to being rejected, didn't handle it well and threatened to seize her kingdom if he couldn't win her over. He established a footing after crossing the Araxes River, which divided his kingdom from the Mage's territory. However, Ptolemus wasn't idle. She rallied her soldiers, spoke with her leaders, and got ready for what she knew was coming. Then, at the direction of his general, the bait Cyrus entered the war. With a magnificent camp brimming with food and wine, luxuries that nomads seldom enjoyed, Harpagus set up a trap and left part of his army behind. Tamias's son Sparapises sent a detachment to investigate, stormed the camp, seized the supplies, and drank the wine fatally. The Persians returned at just the right moment. Drunk, disoriented, and unprepared, Sparapises and his men were overwhelmed. He was captured alive when Tamiris heard the news. Her world cracked. This wasn't just a military loss, it was personal. Her son, her heir, was now a prisoner in Persian hands. She sent a message to Cyrus. "Give me back my son, and leave if you do not. I swear by the sun, the master of the massage, I will give you your fill of blood." Cyrus didn't listen. Sparapises, ashamed of his capture, killed himself in Persian custody. Ptolemus had just lost her only son, and now she was out for blood. Grief is a powerful thing, but grief mixed with fury, that's the recipe for absolute devastation. When Ptolemus learned her son Sparapises had taken his own life in Persian captivity, something inside her snapped. This was no longer about borders pride or even independence. This was war soaked in vengeance. And Ptolemus wasn't one to grieve quietly. She didn't retire to her tent in mourning robes or weep by the fire. No, she mounted her horse, sharpened her weapons, and swore an oath that would echo through history. She would face Cyrus in battle. She would defeat him, and then she would make sure he never forgot her name, even in death. According to Herodotus, Ptolemus summoned her tribal council under her command. The massage mobilized picture it hundreds of warriors on horseback, adorned in leather armor, wielding bows and spears, faces painted with fury. They didn't march like a Persian army. They moved like a storm swift, chaotic, and with deadly precision. This time, she set the trap. Cyrus, perhaps, overconfident from his earlier deception, underestimated her resolve. But Ptolemus knew his tactics now. She studied his movements, waited for the right moment, and then unleashed everything. The two armies clashed in what Herodotus describes as one of the bloodiest battles of the ancient world. There were no fancy formations or long speeches, just screaming horses, clashing blades, and a queen who fought alongside her warriors. No Silk Road empress. Here Ptolemus was in the thick of it, riding hard, cutting down enemies with merciless focus. And when the dust finally settled, Cyrus, the Great, was dead. Ptolemus, ever theatrical in her justice, had his body searched. His head was severed, placed into a wineskin filled with blood, and presented as a final offering. According to Herodotus, she spoke to it, "You thirsted for blood, now drink your fill." Whether or not every detail is true is almost beside the point, because what matters is that Ptolemus won. She crushed the most powerful empire of her day, avenged her son, and made sure that her name would be remembered not as a victim, but as a conqueror. And this was just the start of her legend. The battlefield was silent. The Persians were dead or fleeing, their legendary king, lifeless in the dust. And Ptolemus, she didn't celebrate like a conqueror. She didn't parade through Pepilolis or carve her face into coins. Instead, she stood over Cyrus's body. Her vengeance fulfilled, but her heart still broke in victory. It turned out didn't bring peace. The massage had won more than just a battle. They had turned the tide of empire, The death of Cyrus the Great sent shockwaves across the ancient world, in Babylon, Egypt, and the far corners of the Persian realm. Rumors swirled the unstoppable king had fallen not at the hands of another great empire, but by a nomadic queen who had no throne. No palace, just fury grit and a cavalry of warriors who would ride into hell for her, and yet Ptolemus didn't exploit her victory for conquest. She returned to her people with the same pragmatism she ruled with: no war taxes, no imperial ambitions. She didn't try to seize the Persian throne that wasn't her world. Her justice had been served. Her son had been avenged. The empire could continue without Cyrus. But now it would think twice before ever riding east again. It's worth noting just how rare. This was most rulers after winning a battle of that magnitude would have grabbed power with both hands. But Ptolemus seemed more concerned with preserving her people's freedom than expanding her reach. And yet this is where her story begins to fade. There are no statues, royal tombs, or stone monuments depicting her after the battle. Historians disagree as to whether Herodotus embellished her story, with some arguing that Cyrus died somewhere else, and that the wineskin of blood was a work of poetic fiction. However, even skeptics agree that someone dealt Persia a serious blow, and that it wasn't a king or a general. Rather, it was a queen, a mother, whose love for her son fueled one of the most dramatic reckonings in ancient history. Her story didn't need to be written in stone. It was carried by the wind, as some people still claim that it whispered her name. To understand Ptolemus, you must understand the people she led. The Massagetæ weren't your typical ancient civilization, with marble temples, hanging gardens, or poetry scrolls. The world of the satraps, or Babylonian scribes, was one of mobility, survival, and honor. Picture vast plains with no boundaries, warriors raised in saddles, and herds of horses and cattle as money. Children were taught to ride before they could walk. They hunted, raided, and fought to protect their freedom. Unlike many patriarchal societies of the time, Mahete women were expected to fight. They weren't legends, but rather the norm. When Ptolemus took up a sword and led her people into battle, no one raised an eyebrow because she wasn't acting like a man or defying the law. Rather, she was the norm, just sharper, smarter, and far more dangerous than most. Their society valued justice, and property was communal in many ways. And what mattered was loyalty to the tribe and the ability to defend it. Yes, kings and queens reigned, but they did it by consent rather than oppression. Leaders had to establish their legitimacy via actions rather than bloodlines, and they worshipped the sun. In her well-known warning to Cyrus, Ptolemus was sworn by the sun, the master of the massage. The sun was life, light, and justice, and the divine judge of all oaths. To break one's word was to spit in the face of the heavens. In other words, Ptolemus wasn't an anomaly. Rather, she was the perfect example of the fierce, principled, and proud leader that the Massagetæ admired. While the Persians had bureaucracy, the Massagetæ had freedom. And in one bloody conflict, that freedom held firm because, in a place where Herodotus is frequently referred to as the father of history, which is fantastic until you realize that he is also the father of myth, hearsay, and dramatic flair. The man loved a good story, and if it included divine omens, gory retaliation, or queens pushing heads into blood, that's even better. How much of his story is true depends on how much you trust a Greek writing decades after the events, who had likely never received a massage in his life, as Herodotus relied on second-hand accounts, traveler tales, and whatever rumors were circulating in the Persian Empire. To him, history was more than just a record, it was a performance. Herodotus went out of his way to spotlight a steppe queen who brought down one of the greatest rulers in history. That's not nothing. But let's zoom out. Why did this tale spread so widely? Simple. It had everything. A noble woman, a tragic son, a cunning enemy, a battle to the death, and a gory finale worthy of any Greek tragedy. If you were living in Athens or Thebes and heard this tale from a traveling bard, you'd remember Ptolemus forever, not because she wore a crown, but because she dared to defy a superpower and won, and over time, her story morphed. Medieval chronicles painted her as a savage Amazon. Renaissance artists depicted her drenched in blood, holding Cyrus's head like a trophy. She was exotic, fearsome, and iconic. Yet through all the retellings, something real clings to her legend. Maybe not the exact dialogue, maybe not the wineskin, but the bones of the story. The queen, the sun, the war, the victory feels too specific, too human to be pure invention. In the end, Herodotus didn't just preserve Tamias. He mythologized her, and while that may blur the lines between fact and fiction, it also ensured that her name would live far longer than Cyrus's imperial edicts, because history forgets generals, but it remembers vengeance for a queen with no surviving monuments. In 1622, Reuben painted Tomius calmly holding a severed head, while courtiers watched in wonder. In another, she stands regal and composed, while Cyrus's decapitated head is ceremoniously dunked into a golden vessel brimming with blood. While this may not be particularly memorable to European artists, Tantalus has haunted the imagination of empires for more than 2,000 years. Renaissance painters adored her because she was a dramatic muse. Timaeus was more than simply a historical person. She was a symbol of a woman who chastised arrogance and a barbaric aristocrat. A warning story. She was also a feminist figure who appeared in plays, novels, and philosophical tracts during the 18th and 19th centuries. Depending on who was holding the brush, she could symbolize the wisdom of a ruler who refused to be bought, the barbarism of the East, or the righteous wrath of a mother. She remained in paper, but strangely, her own people left no records. Enlightenment intellectuals argued over whether she was evidence that women could govern sensibly, or a reminder of what happens when emotions take over. Later, nomadic cultures either absorbed or eradicated the Masag from history. There are no carved monuments or burial mounds with gold plaques stating that Tamiris was present. Instead, her memory has only persisted in the eyes of strangers, but she continued to emerge in Central Asia during the Soviet era. Statues of Tamias were placed in Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan when she was reclaimed as a symbol of struggle against imperialism. She was re-evaluated by contemporary scholars as a legitimate head of state, a woman who ruled, led armies, and negotiated from a position of strength. She has been featured in everything from video games to documentaries. One minute she is a playable leader in a strategy game, and the next she is being examined in scholarly journals on gender and power. The odd thing is that we still don't even know what she looked like. No coins, busts, or carvings. But we do know what she stood for: strength, retaliation, autonomy, legacy in a society that disregards well-behaved queens. Although Tomius wasn't the first or last woman to lead warriors into battle, history tends to treat women like her as exceptions. She did not request to be included in the art gallery of history. Instead, she kicked down the door and posed for the bloodiest portrait ever painted. Isolated flashes of power in a man's world. The truth, Tamias was part of a long, often overlooked lineage of women who ruled through. The sword. Let's rewind a bit. Before Tamias, there was Shamuramat, the Assyrian queen who may have inspired the mythical Semiramis, builder of cities and slayer of rebels. Around the same era, the Scythians, cultural cousins of the Massagetæ, had female warriors buried with weapons, their skeletons showing clear signs of battle injuries. These weren't ceremonial roles. These women fought, bled, and died on horseback. And after Timurius came more Boudica, the Celtic queen who led a fiery revolt against the Roman Empire in the 1st century CE, and is often compared to her, like Tamiris. Boudica's war was sparked by personal loss. Her daughters were assaulted, her land seized. Her response? She burnt Roman settlements to ash. The parallels are uncanny. Grief, vengeance, and an empire too arrogant to see what was coming. There's also Zenobia, queen of Palmyra, who in the 3rd century CE defied Rome itself and carved out her own mini-empire in the east. She minted coins with her face, declared independence, and made the emperor come to her. What binds all these women together? Tamias was not an exception. Rather, she was a part of a global, centuries-long pattern of women who rose in times of crisis and made kings bleed. Her story, preserved by Greek pens and modern imagination, reminds us that female leadership wasn't uncommon. They led in societies that pretended leadership belonged to men. They wielded authority not as carers or stand-ins, but as strategists, generals, and rulers. While many male leaders were praised for their conquests, these women were frequently referred to as dangerous, unnatural, and savage. Timaeus wasn't alone. She was one of the few they couldn't erase. She never constructed a palace and left behind golden inscriptions and dynastic walls. Because it was so infrequently documented, when you imagine ancient warfare, you don't just see helmets and beards. Instead, you see a queen riding a horse with a bow in her hand and blood in her eyes. No big tomb exists. She perseveres in many ways despite having no museum-preserved armor or marble bust. Her legacy is contradictory. Her entire narrative is based on a few biased, inflated, and possibly fabricated passages from Herodotus. But those words sowed a seed that persisted. For more than 2 millennia, she has been reimagined through a variety of lenses, from Renaissance Europe to modern Central Asia, where she was a noble savage who served as a warning to tyrants. She became a folk hero and a symbol of resistance and national pride, particularly in nations still dealing with colonial and imperial pasts. Her name has repeatedly come up when the world needed to remember that power doesn't always wear a crown or a beard. Monuments depicting her ascent from Kazakhstani plazas. Her name is taught to kids in textbooks. Politicians use her to invoke strength and independence, but her narrative has a human element that goes beyond myth and symbolism. It is the story of a mother who lost her son, a commander who had to decide between surviving and surrendering, and a person who, in a society that frequently obliterates the names of warrior women, decided to fight and prevail when confronted by one of the greatest powers in history. As she reminds us that history isn't just about kings and empires, but also about mothers and queens' pain and retaliation, Timaeus endures like a blade buried just beneath the surface, always ready to be found by a new generation eager for tales of untamed rebellion. The quiet moments following a war, when a woman stands by herself in a field full of bodies, knowing that she has altered the course of history but that no one will ever believe her, may be her greatest legacy, refusing to be forgotten. No statues, no issue. Her name still floats on the breeze of the steppes, her legend still whispers the warning, and her narrative still makes emperors seem mortal. Come for me, and you'll drink your fill of blood. The next time you hear about the fall of a great king, keep in mind that sometimes the last blow is delivered by a queen on horseback, lost to history, but never really gone. Imagine living in a world where your front door is open to the horizon, your roof is stitched from hide, and your walls are made of felt. For ancient nomadic cultures, there are no cities, farms, or stone monuments to pass on to the future. Just the sound of hooves, the whisper of grass, and the constantly shifting sky. From the Arabian deserts to the Eurasian steppes, ancient nomads reshaped entire civilizations without leaving a single marble temple. They weren't ruthless nomads. Rather, they were strategic movers who were guided by the seasons, their herds' grazing patterns, and a thorough knowledge of the terrain. Their homes were yurts, tents, or wheeled wagons, foldable strongholds made for a mobile lifestyle. The mainstays of nomadic existence were cattle, sheep, goats, and most importantly, horses. A person's wealth was measured in livestock rather than land, and horses were more than just tools. They were companions. Being mobile did not equate to being disorganized, but having weapons and status symbols was necessary to ride well in order to live, and to ride best in order to reign. Power was typically distributed through clans and tribes in nomadic societies, and leadership was frequently determined by influence and merit, rather than rigid inheritance. A chief or Ka-en may ascend to prominence through strategic acumen, persuasive speech, or simple charisma. Loyalty was acquired on a personal level in campfire councils and on windswept battlefields, and nomads were the link between the world and the outside world. They transported spices from India and silk from China, European slaves and Persian silver. Their history wasn't written in stone. Instead, it was sung, recited, and remembered by elders who passed down laws and legends through oral tradition. A tribe's entire legal system, history, and identity could be carried in the mind of a single bard or elder story. In the eyes of empires, these individuals were the first transcontinental couriers, and when trade broke down, they raided quickly, strategically, and terrifyingly efficiently. While the Saiyans ruled the windswept steppe between the 9th and 2nd centuries BCE, these nomadic warriors dominated the lands stretching from the Black Sea to the edges of Central Asia. To the Greeks, they were fearsome horsemen and exotic barbarians, but to themselves, they were guardians of freedom, masters of adaptation and heirs to the wind. They left few ruins behind, but each time they rode, they reshaped the world. The foundation of Saiyan civilization was mobility and violence. Boys learnt to ride before they could walk properly, and their weapons were both useful and lethal. Archaeological discoveries also show that women fought alongside men, as evidenced by the discovery of female skeletons buried with weapons and bearing battle wounds that only resulted from actual combat. The Scythian warriors didn't build cities, but their burial mounds have preserved their legacy beneath them. They also had short composite bows that were perfect for shooting while galloping at full speed, curved swords, battle axes, and iron-tipped spears. The Saiyans were not only untamed raiders, they were also diplomats, mercenaries, and traders, particularly with Greek colonies along the Black Sea. They sold furs, slaves, and grain in exchange for imported wine, pottery, and luxury goods. Archaeologists have discovered intricate gold, tattoos on preserved skin, embroidered garments, and intricate weapons. Their art style, full of swirling animals and predatory symbolism, reflects a life bound to nature and the hunt. Greek writers both admired and feared the Saiyans. Herodotus described their peculiar practices, such as using scalps as napkins or drinking the blood of opponents, but he also commended their justice and kinship loyalty. Their religion was primitive and animistic, and they worshipped fertility, fire, and war gods. Horse sacrifice was used in some rites, while cannabis smoke was used in others. As a result of pressure from other nomadic groups like the Sarmatians and being surrounded by expanding empires, their cyclical worldview and connection to the land, not in terms of ownership but rather sacred movement, finally disappeared. They didn't write books, but when you see a mounted archer silhouetted against the steppe, that shadow is Scythian. The Saiyans were the storm before the empire, and the Bedouins carved their legacy into sand, originating in the vast deserts of the Arabian Peninsula. The Saiyans vanished into history, but they established the standard for the steppe warrior archetype, a mobile, deadly, fiercely independent fighter without a master or fixed home. Unlike the mounted thunder of steppe nomads, the Bedouin were not just nomadic people, they were survival engineers who had mastered some of the most hostile terrain on Earth. Their way of life was more subdued and methodical, centered on the cycles of the desert drought, rainfall, grazing routes, and star movements. The Bedouin were renowned for their tribal structure, and everything revolved around the clan's loyalty to kin. Their home was the betelsh, or black goat hair tent, which was portable, breathable, and easy to pack. Life moved with the camels, also known as the ships of the desert, which transported food, clothing, and currency all at once. Honor or sheriff was the social bond, not merely a term. A blood feud could be sparked by a single remark, yet hospitality to guests was equally sacred, and a stranger could expect food, water, and protection for 3 days without any questions. Their warfare was based on the raid or gazu, which were quick, strategic attacks meant to capture goods and livestock without needless bloodshed. The battle was about survival, prestige, and honor. A successful raid raised a man's status, while a failed one could damage a tribe's reputation for generations. However, Bedouin life was not all conflict and sandstorms. It was rich in oral tradition. The poets were warriors of words, and their verses preserved history, shamed enemies, and praised heroes. Poetry was passed down from memory to memory, frequently performed in a song-like cadence around the fire. Some of the poems became tribal lore, while others became legacy trade caravans that traveled through Bedouin lands. These tribesmen served as guides, protectors, and occasionally smugglers, transporting goods like silk, spices, and incense from southern Arabia to the Levant. And beyond, they knew every oasis, every star path. Their knowledge was legendary and expensive. Though many Bedouins later integrated into cities and empires, they maintained a fierce sense of identity. Even today, the black tent and tribal codes remain symbols of Bedouin pride. They weren't just survivors of the desert, they were its soul. No nomadic people have ever reshaped the world quite like the Mongols in the 13th century. These steppe riders erupted out of the plains of Mongolia and carved out the largest contiguous land empire in history. But their roots were no different than the other nomadic cultures they followed. Mobile, clan-based, and fiercely adaptive life on the Mongolian steppe was brutal and demanding. The Mongols lived in circular felt tents made of jars that could be assembled in under an hour and packed onto a cart the next morning. Their herds of horses, yaks, and goats sustained them, and their children were raised in the saddle. Riding was a skill learnt before literacy. In fact, most Mongols couldn't read, but they didn't need to. Their knowledge was encoded in songs, proverbs, and memory. Mongol warfare was a ballet of speed and deception. Their horse archers could fire accurately at full gallop, fake retreats to lure enemies and travel over 100 miles a day. However, they weren't just raiders. They were strategists who used scouts, spies, signal flags, and psychological warfare with terrifying precision once they began conquering cities. This was what made the Mongols unique. Under Genghis Khan, tribal divisions were broken up and reorganized into a new merit-based system, and loyalty to the Khan replaced tribal loyalty. The Mongols gained expertise in building catapults, flaming arrows, and battering rams, and they employed them with terrifying skill after siege engineers from China and Persia joined their ranks. However, the surprise is that they weren't only destroyers. A Muslim merchant, a Christian priest, and a Buddhist monk could all travel freely under Mongol rule as long as they didn't rebel. But they remained nomads at heart, despite ruling empires. The Mongol Empire connected the world in ways never seen before. They restored and safeguarded the Silk Road, guaranteeing safe passage from China to Europe. They also introduced paper currency, passport systems, and religious tolerance throughout their vast network. Mongol emperors continued to return to their tents, herds, and open steppe after conquering cities. But they never really belonged to them, because they always rode to the sedentary empires with the wind at their backs, regardless of how high they soared. Trade was essential to nomadic life because most nomads couldn't grow grain or make pottery. Instead, they needed tools. Nomads saw the line between raid and trade as negotiable. One day they would escort your caravans across the desert, and the next they would pillage your border towns. This depended on the situation, the time of year, and how much you paid. In return, they offered luxury products, linens, spices, and exotic objects like rare horses or falcons, as well as animals, leather, and salt. These weren't just merchant caravans. They were armed convoys prepared to defend themselves or attack, depending on the situation. For example, a tribal leader might negotiate with a border governor one week and then raid his storehouses the next. Empires called this treachery nomad options. Some traded directly with empires, while others served as middlemen between distant regions, creating vital links along the Silk Road incense route and other transcontinental paths. The Bedouins guarded incense and spice caravans throughout Arabia. If someone didn't pay protection costs, the camels would change course. The Syrians, for instance, traded grain and gold to Greek cities along the Black Sea. But if a city attempted to defraud them, they torched it. When Genghis Khan's Mongols first attempted to engage in peaceful trade with the Khwarezmian Empire, they responded by destroying entire cities. To the nomadic people, trade was not just business, it was a sign of respect. If a sedentary kingdom treated the nomads as equals, commerce flourished. If they treated them disrespectfully, punishment was swift and typically carried out on horseback. This tension led to an odd relationship. Economies along borders, cities and towns bordering nomadic areas frequently developed into hybrid environments. This dance between trade and raid wasn't a weakness of nomadic life. Rather, it was a characteristic that allowed them to negotiate power without occupying territory, influence empires without building them, and remain fluid in a world that worshipped walls. They didn't need to conquer cities. They just needed cities to keep an eye on the horizon in a world without libraries. Half military outpost, half market, governors bribed chieftains and tribes, traded news, horses, and intelligence, and occasionally printing presses or scrolls. How can nomadic civilizations retain their history? You recall that the response was straightforward and extremely potent. From the Sayan grasslands to the Mongol plains and the Bedouin deserts, oral tradition was more than just a storytelling tool for the ancient nomads. It was their library, courtroom, constitution, and mythology all combined into one. Elders were more than just old men and women. They were human archives who knew lineages dating back a dozen generations, war stories that shaped tribal identity, and proverbs that guided decisions in both peace and battle. Among the Bedouins, poetry was king. A well-written verse could embarrass an enemy, honor a fallen warrior, or settle a dispute. Poets or shy advisors to tribal leaders were remembered more clearly than many chiefs, and their words could start a conflict or put an end to it. Whole epics were transmitted verbatim from one generation to the next, and the Mongols were no exception. The magnificent work known as the Secret History of the Mongols was initially recorded orally and only later written down. It is not a dry historical record. Rather, it describes not only the ascent of Genghis Khan, but also the cultural values of loyalty, fate, retaliation, and ambition that characterize their civilization. A living saga. When Greek writers like Herodotus recounted their stories, they were capturing echoes of a much older spoken tradition. History passed through campfires, not carved in stone. Oral tradition had its risks. Originally, it was recited by heart to teach and unite even the Scythians, who left behind nearly no written records. They also kept detailed oral accounts of their migrations, battles, and alliances. In many ancient civilizations, women were relegated to the background, silently veiled, or confined behind palace walls. However, in nomadic societies, the story was often very different. On the move, everyone worked, and that meant women held power too. From the Sayans to the Mongols, nomadic societies were able to maintain their identity despite migrations, defeats, and cultural absorption. Empires may have fallen and their archives turned to dust, but nomadic stories survived because they were woven into breath, and as long as someone remembered, nothing was truly lost. In the case of the Sayans, for instance, burial sites throughout the Eurasian steppe have revealed women buried with swords, arrows, and armor, their bones showing injuries from combat. These were not symbolic burials. Rather, Greek historians were so fascinated and terrified that they created entire myths about fierce Amazon warrior women, supposedly descended from these nomadic tribes in Mongol society. In addition to being mothers and wives, these women were also riders, warriors, shamans, diplomats, and clan leaders. One of the most influential women in Mongol history, Genghis Khan's daughters and daughters-in-law frequently commanded regions, led armies, and engaged in diplomacy. In some tribes, women were able to initiate divorces, control property, and even own camels, the ultimate symbol of wealth and survival. Sagakani Beki was a strategist and kingmaker who raised emperors and mediated alliances among the Bedouins. Although women had fewer positions of public leadership, they still wielded influence through poetry, family alliances, and the sacred traditions of hospitality. A woman's tent was her domain. Mobility created necessity, and necessity gave rise to equality, at least more than what was seen in most empires at the time. The unpredictable nature of nomadic life demanded flexibility, and in many Turk and Siberian steppe cultures, female shamans played crucial roles as healers, spirit guides, and keepers of ancestral wisdom. They were not fringe mystics. If a man fell in battle, a woman stepped up without ceremony, without asking permission. In these windswept societies, A woman could be the hand that rocked the cradle and the hand that drew the bow for nomadic peoples. Spirituality was not tied to temples or sacred buildings. It was woven into the land, the sky, and the journey itself. When your life is in constant motion, your gods ride with you. Nomadic belief systems were typically animistic and nature-based, rooted in the cycles of the seasons, the behavior of animals, and the rhythms of survival. The wind wasn't just weather, it was a messenger. Mountains were guardians, and rivers carried spirits. Fire was sacred. Life was a dialogue with the unseen among the scions described by Herodotus. Worship centered on a pantheon of gods tied to the natural world. Titi, the goddess of the hearth, likely equivalent to Hestia, and Papios, the sky, god. Rituals often involved horse sacrifice, cannabis smoke, and sacred oaths sworn under open skies. Their spiritual world was visceral, earthy, and direct. No priests in robes, just warriors and shamans calling to the heavens. Prior to the spread of Islam, the Bedouins were polytheists who worshipped local gods and tribe idols, but they also held a deep respect for the enigmatic powers of nature and fate. Poets and seers were assumed to be inspired by, and occasionally, even possessed by, jinn or spirits, which were thought to reside in rocks, windstorms, and desolate areas. In Mongol culture, hospitality was more than just a tradition. It was a spiritual duty. Tangrism, the worship of Tangri, the endless blue sky, served as the foundation of the spiritual universe. Tangri was the sky itself, constantly observing and judging. He was not a god to whom you prayed in a shrine. Genghis Khan asserted that the Tangri Mongols gave him the right to reign. He also worshipped ancestral ghosts and soil spirits, and shamanism was essential to the sacred fire in the middle of each tent. Shamans were healers, spirit guides, and political advisors. The beauty of nomadic spirituality was its adaptability, as nomads came into contact with Buddhists, Muslims, Christians, and others. They often blended these beliefs with their own Mongol emperors, patronized multiple religions at once. A Bedouin could follow Islamic law, while still clinging to older desert-rooted customs, whereas cities built temples to contain the divine. Nomads carried the sacred with them. Their gods moved their rituals, adapted, and their beliefs flowed like the rivers they crossed. Because to a nomad, faith didn't need four walls, just sky above, earth below, and memory in between. They didn't leave behind pyramids or cathedrals. You won't find their capitals on modern maps, and yet the legacy of ancient nomadic cultures is written all over history in the flow of trade, the scars of conquest, and even the languages we speak. Nomads were not historical footnotes. They were architects of disruption, reshaping entire continents through movement. The Silk Road, that wasn't just a route for silk and spices, it was a highway built by hooves, maintained by the diplomacy muscle and local knowledge of nomadic tribes. Without them, East and West might never have met. Empires feared them, and for good reason. The Scions, Xiongnu. When cities relied on walls, nomads adapted. And when Turks and Mongols challenged the myth of urban superiority, their victories revealed a fundamental truth: mobility can outthink monuments. However, their influence extended beyond the military. They also served as cultural bridges, bringing Chinese printing technology to Persia. Arab Bedouin traditions shaped the early Islamic world, from language and law to poetry and honor codes, and nomads relied on speed. Turkish nomads laid the groundwork for the Ottoman Empire. The paths they rode became arteries of civilization. Even after their empires faded, their spirit endured. You can see it in modern horsemanship, in oral storytelling cultures, and in the values of kinship, resilience, and independence that still echo across the steppe desert and tundra. In many ways, they also serve as a warning. They remind us that no structure is permanent, not even the grandest empire. They proved that the wind could erase borders, and that power didn't need to be carved in stone to be real. Today, many nomadic peoples still exist, though fewer in number and often under pressure from modern borders, climate change and urbanization. Yet their descendants carry traditions older than most nations: hospitality to strangers, reverence for animals and stories that ride through generations like horses through fog. So when you study history, don't just look at the walls, the temples, the thrones, look between them. That's where the nomads lived. And that's where history moved in the mid-1800s. America was a country divided not just by politics, but by terrain. The East bustled with cities, factories and ports. The West was a wild expanse of mountains, deserts and gold fields, and between them stretched over 1,700 tons of unforgiving wilderness. To journey from New York to California meant weeks on a ship around Cape Horn, or months in a wagon dodging disease bandits and dust. But the dream was there, a railroad that would tie the country together. Steel rail by steel rail, a direct line from coast to coast, unthinkable to some, inevitable to others. Visionaries believed it could unite the republic, speed up communication, move armies, open new markets, and settle the untamed. Frontier to build it, however, would require more than ambition. It would take money, labor land, and political power. That last part came with the Civil War in 1862, while the nation was tearing itself apart. Abraham Lincoln signed the Pacific Railway Act. The law authorized two railroad companies, the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific, to start building from opposite ends of the country. The Union Pacific would head west from Omaha, Nebraska. The Central Pacific would go east from Sacramento, California. They would meet in the middle to fuel the construction. The government offered massive land grants for every mile of track laid. Each company received up to 640 acres of public land and generous loans. The race was on, not just to unite the country, but to claim land money and history itself on paper. It was a marvel of infrastructure. In reality, it was about to become one of the most grueling construction efforts in American history. Workers would blast through Mountains Bridge, vast plains, and brave bitter winters and scorching deserts. In 1862, the idea still sounded like a gamble, but within 7 years, two lines would meet in the Utah desert and change America forever. While the Union Pacific had the flat plains of Nebraska ahead of them, the rewards would be enormous, but so would the human cost. And for the indigenous nations living on the land where the tracks would cut through like a scar, this was not progress, but a warning. From the beginning, the Central Pacific confronted an even more formidable obstacle. Construction started in Sacramento in 1863, but the actual wall was only 80 meters east. The Sierra Nevada mountains were not gentle hills. Rather, they were towering granite peaks that were prone to avalanches, snowdrifts, and backbreaking terrain. The Sierras were a formidable barricade, and every mile of track laid felt like a war against nature itself. To overcome this obstacle, the Central Pacific needed a lot of labor, initially hiring mostly Irish immigrants and white laborers, but many quit because they couldn't or wouldn't endure the difficult conditions. At that point, the business hired new employees. By 1865, more than 10,000 Chinese immigrants were working on the railway, making up more than 80% of the Central Pacific's workforce. They were paid less than white workers, frequently lived in hazardous conditions, and encountered severe racism, but they proved invaluable by demonstrating extraordinary skill, endurance, and discipline. Their work was both heroic and horrifying. They used only hand tools and black powder to carve tunnels through solid rock. The most notorious tunnel, number 6, took over 2 years to finish. During the winter, when snowdrifts reached 40 feet, workers slept in camps buried beneath the snow and were connected by vertical shafts that resembled chimneys. Dozens of people perished in rock slides, avalanches, and explosions, but the line continued to advance to speed up progress. There are few records of individual Chinese workers, and no statues were erected for them at the time. But without their hands, the transcontinental dream would have died in the Sierras by 1867, when the Central Pacific finally emerged from the mountains. Chinese crews hung themselves in baskets over cliffs, chipping away at stone inch by inch. When they couldn't go around a mountain, they went through it. When they couldn't level terrain, they built wooden trestles that soared above ravines. The worst was behind them, but the desert ahead was hard, dry, and deadly. While the Central Pacific was struggling with granite and snow in the west, the Union Pacific had its own race to run, beginning in Omaha, Nebraska, to reach the meeting place. The Union Pacific employed a huge number of Irish immigrants, former Union soldiers, and liberated men. The firm set out westward across the Great Plains, a region that appeared boundless, flat, and deceptively simple. However, the challenge was not topography, but rather people, politics, and power. After the Civil War, many soldiers were searching for stable employment. Crews could lay 2 or even 3 miles of track in a single day, thanks to the open plains, which allowed for speed, but also exposed the workers to environmental extremes, raids, and malnutrition. The Parangi was an indigenous land. For Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Lakota Sioux, who had hunted, lived, and died on these plains for generations, the railroad represented an invasion rather than advancement. Tribal hunting grounds were directly traversed by the track. When the telegraph poles, surveyors, and smoke-belching motors disturbed sacred areas and scared buffalo herds, the tribes realized that settlers, soldiers, fences, and displacement were coming, and resistance was unavoidable. The Lakota Sioux, led by Red Cloud, retaliated violently, raiding camps, attacking surveying teams, and tearing up rails. In response, the US government erected forts along the route and stationed troops to guard the railroad. The construction of the railroad turned into a militarized operation, with track layers working under the protection of armed guards. The war was a low-grade conflict fought with rifles and treaties that never lasted for the indigenous nations, and they were right. By 1867, Union Pacific had reached Cheyenne and was on its way into Wyoming. The mountains loomed on the horizon, but the true mountain they were ascending was political, and whiskey and violence followed the workers like a dust storm. Lay the track, don't look back. The story of the Transcontinental Railroad is often told with golden spikes and great men in top hats, but the real story is soaked in sweat, muscle, and pain. Much of it provided by men whose names were never recorded, whose graves were never marked, and whose stories were buried beneath the tracks they built on the Central Pacific. How do you unite a nation when you're laying rails over the bones of another? Asked the Union Pacific. Despite being labeled weak and unfit by early skeptics, the Chinese crews quickly proved to be the most dependable workforce on the railway. They blasted rock, laid rail, built trestles, and cooked their own food, often staying healthier than their counterparts. Almost 15,000 of them, the majority from Guangdong province, endured freezing temperatures, deadly explosions, and racial hostility while tunneling through the Sierra Nevada. They earned less than white workers and received no recognition. A picture was taken on the Union Pacific in the meantime. Irish immigrants made up a large portion of the workforce. Many had survived famine and war, only to face new dangers on. The planes they fought off raids laid track at incredible speed and drank themselves to sleep in rickety tents. Their lives were hard, but their labor was essential. Former enslaved African Amines also worked the rails, some hired as freed men seeking better lives. Their contributions, like those of the Chinese and Irish, went largely uncredited. Laborers of color were exploited, but indispensable. This was a multinational workforce, building a nation with bare hands and broken backs. And then there were the cooks, blacksmiths, teamsters, and supply haulers, each playing a role in keeping the great machine of progress moving forward. None of them were executives, but without them, there'd be no golden spike in the grand American myth we tend to spotlight the visionaries and tycoons. But railroads weren't laid by dreams alone. They were laid by calloused hands, underpaid men, and marginalized workers. People who bent history with no guarantee they'd be remembered. They didn't build the railroad for glory. They built it to survive. By the late 1860s. The two railroad companies, the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific, were no longer just building tracks. They were locked in a frenzied competition, each racing toward an invisible meeting point, somewhere in the Utah Territory. But this wasn't a gentleman's agreement. It was a war for land money and prestige. Why the urgency? Because of the way the government subsidies worked for every mile of track completed. Each company received federal, land grants and hefty loans. Naturally, both sides attempted to outbuild one another, even installing parallel tracks in opposing directions, knowing full well that only one set would be used. This led to ludicrous crews working at breakneck pace, because the more track you laid, the more profit you claimed. In contrast, the Union Pacific crossed rivers and high plains that skirted the edge of the Rocky Mountains. They even started laying track through areas they knew the government would eventually declare wasteful in order to secure funding, and work accelerated to almost manic levels. The Central Pacific, having recently defeated the Sierra Nevada, now blasted through the deserts of Nevada and Utah. Despite continuous labor strikes, supply problems, and poor financial management, the Chinese crews of the Central Pacific set a world record in April 1869 by laying 10 meters of track in a single day. This accomplishment is still unmatched today. They achieved this by using synchronized teams that rotated shifts and a rhythm developed over years of labor Union Pacific crews. When the two tracks eventually approached one another at Promontory Summit in modern-day Utah, surveyors noted the location and plans were made for a formal celebration, including locomotives from both companies. Thomas Durant, who was more concerned with stock manipulation than railroad engineering, on May 10, 1869, the windswept plains of Promontory Summit, Utah, became the center of the American universe. Behind the celebration, however, was the lingering reality that the race had been brutal, often reckless, and entirely driven by profit. The rails were now joined, but the scars they left behind on land, labor, and lives would remain for generations. Progress had a finish line, and both companies were willing to trample over anything to cross it. Central Pacific's Jupiter and Union Pacific's the Transcontinental Railroad was completed, and two shining locomotives stood nose to nose on the completed track, the Union Pacific's number 119 and the Central Pacific's Jupiter, with a final rail between them and a golden spike in the middle that read, "May God continue the unity of our country as this railroad unites the two great oceans of the world." Officials, journalists, and railroad executives gathered to witness the historic event. As Leland Stamford, representing the Central Pacific, hoisted the ceremonial hammer, telegraph cables were attached to it, meaning that each blow would send an electric signal across the nation. With every swing, the telegraph clicked, church bells rang, cannons fired, and cities from New York to San Francisco erupted in celebration. It seemed as though a national artery had been stitched together in real time, with the East and West, no longer being months apart but only 7 days apart by rail. It was a breathtaking feat of engineering. Not everyone joined in the celebration, but the symbolic significance of the United States being united coast to coast by steel and steam could not be exaggerated. The young post-Civil War nation had demonstrated its ability to unite its many components and march into a new industrial period. While the nation celebrated unity, the reality was more complicated. The railroad did connect east to west, but also sharpened divisions between races, classes, and cultures. It united markets, but at the cost of many human lives. The photo that day captured the official story of the railroad, but the real story was buried beneath the track. None of the Chinese workers who had laid the majority of the Central Pacific's track were invited to the photo. They had been completely excluded from the United States was no longer a bi-coastal country, uncomfortably linked by wildness. Rather, it was a single economic organism pulsing with mobility, commerce, and opportunity after the Transcontinental Railroad was completed. This development did more than just compress geography. It also inflated the American economy virtually immediately. Previously taking months to transport by wagon or ship, manufactured goods flowed in the opposite direction. Agricultural products from the Midwest, such as wheat, corn, and cattle, could be shipped eastward to the industrial cities or westward to booming mining towns. An insecure frontier was transformed into a lucrative supply chain as rail cars replaced oxen, steam replaced sails, and along the railway, villages sprung up like weeds and almost immediately became cities. Others vanished as soon as they arose, particularly if the rail line changed. But each one was a node in an expanding network linked by a constant cadence of smoke, whistles, and pistons. Additionally, the railway fueled the expansion of industry. As demand for rails increased, so did the demand for ironworks, coal mines, and timber mills. Along the way, small business owners opened hotels, restaurants, and general stores, while steel barons and railway tycoons made money, and bankers lined their wallets thanks to locomotives and infrastructure that produced jobs across the country. For the first time, the government was able to project a real presence across the entire continent, deploying troops, resources, and political influence wherever the rails reached. Not to mention the human factor, millions of people moved west, with immigrants from Europe who had previously landed in New York, now seeing a direct path to land and labor in California. Mail moved more quickly, and news traveled across time zones in days rather than weeks. There is no doubting that the railroad turned the US from a regional republic into a continental power. The engine wasn't just moving people, it was moving money, power, and the future. And once it started, it wasn't going to stop. Homesteaders, prospectors, ranchers, and outlaws all rode the same steel road towards destiny in Oregon and the Western Territories. Of course, this boom wasn't evenly shared. Native lands were devoured, laborers remained impoverished, and wealth flowed upward. The annihilation of indigenous cultures and lands. In addition to connecting east and west, the railway cut across native areas, establishing roots in Lakota territory. Ute, Cheyenne Shoshone, and numerous others. Rails, telegraph poles, and fencing had divided what had previously been vast plains and sacred terrain. The impact was swift and severe, with each spike eroding native sovereignty. Once numbering in the tens of millions, buffalo herds that were essential to the economies, diets, and spirituality of plains tribes were mass murdered to make room for trains and settlers. In some cases, passengers were encouraged to shoot buffalo for sport from moving trains. These herds nearly went extinct in a matter of decades. The railroad brought more than just railroad tracks. It also brought settlers, soldiers, and surveyors. Towns appeared where there had been no homesteaders, and the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho and other tribes fought back in a series of bloody wars that were justified in the name of progress. Some of these wars were called uprisings, while others were outright massacres. From the Red Cloud's War to the Battle of Little Bighorn, the railroad served as both the battlefield and the prize. Eventually, resistance was crushed, and indigenous nations were forced to live on reservations that were frequently hundreds of miles from their ancestral lands. The psychological toll was severe. Sacred sites were desecrated, hunting patterns were disrupted, and vast open spaces were forced into fixed locations under constant surveillance. Although it cost 1,000 nations' aspirations, the Transcontinental Railway was praised as a feat of American ingenuity. Iron wasn't the only thing that sliced through the landscape. Timets and timbers also displaced a way of life. When the last spike was driven at Promontory Summit in 1869, it wasn't simply the end of a railway. It was the start of a new American identity. History books frequently commend the railway for bringing the country together, but for Native Americans, it tore it apart. Quicker, more ravenous, and more influenced by steam and steel. The country was reduced in size by the Transcontinental. In railway, what had previously taken 6 months by wagon or ship now took 7 days by rail. This altered the way people moved, how goods were traded, and how people understood distance altogether. Suddenly, the idea of a coast-to-coast country was not just a pipe dream, but a reality. The railway also fueled the creation of time zones to facilitate cross-country travel and commerce. It fueled the Second Industrial Revolution by reorganizing agriculture to enable farmers to ship their produce across state borders and facilitating the efficient flow of raw materials into urban manufacturers. The cacophony of trains started to blend into the country's cadence. With railroads crisscrossing deserts, mountains, and plains, the idea that America was destined to spread from the Atlantic to the Pacific was culturally reinforced by the railroad, which made development seem not only feasible but inevitable. The untamed frontier was no longer there. Everything seemed accessible and claimable, but the railway also established the model for corporate power in America, with top executives like Leland Stanford amassing enormous fortunes. In addition to being wealthy, Thomas Durant and Collis, Huntington influenced legislation, purchased politicians, and established empires. Corruption scandals such as the Crédit Mobilier case revealed the extent to which railway interests were ingrained in the government for the benefit of workers. For indigenous peoples, the rail tracks symbolized both opportunity and exploitation. For the environment, they signaled the end of a world and brought about drastic change. The railway unquestionably stitched the fabric of a modern America, despite all of its costs. It connected immigrants to opportunity, businesses, markets, and governments to distant territories, transforming an experimental republic into a fully sovereign nation. The iron rails carried more than just passengers. They carried ambition, destruction, hope, and hubris. The nation was changed by iron and fire, not by war or election. After those twin trains hit cowcatchers in the Utah desert, the railway was both a victory and a tragedy.